there, and welcome to the Surviving Trauma Stories of Hope podcast. In today's episode, I am excited to introduce you to my special guest, Lea Misan. Lea is a process-oriented psychotherapist, an expat coach, facilitator, trainer, blogger, and she is the executive director of Act for Change. As a parent, Lea was inspired by those who acted to save a life at a moment of violent trauma and dispossession during the Holocaust. Act for Change was born out of a leap of imagination that each of us can connect, share, and extend the possibility of empathy. Her mission is to stop exclusion from escalating into violence. To achieve this, she aims to let no child be left out and to create an inclusive circle of support around each child. Lea is also passionate about helping internationals, expat, and global nomads to achieve clarity around how to take charge of life, work, and wealth to shape their future and finally find a home in the world. Lea was born in Jerusalem. She grew up in Geneva and now lives in London, UK with her husband and 3 children. It was fantastic to have Lea join me, and I loved our conversation. Thank you to my listeners for joining me on this journey. Comment on the posts on Instagram, Facebook, or LinkedIn, and let me know what you think of this episode. Also, head to Amazon.com or takealot.com and get your copy of my book, Ray of Light, and please leave me a rating and review. It would mean the world to me. Also, please check out my website and download your free journal prompt and a relaxing meditation on the resources page. As always, stay tuned and keep listening. Good afternoon, Lea. Welcome to the Surviving Trauma Stories of Hope podcast. I'm so excited to have you join me today. How are you doing?
Thank you so much, Marlene. I'm doing very well. Excited to be here.
Fantastic. You are a psychologist and an expat coach, but you also have such an interesting background of where you grew up. You want to share some of that with us?
Yes, I'm happy to. So I'm a bit of a nomad in terms of how I grew up. So I was born in Israel. I then spent my primary school years in Canada, in Montreal. And then for the rest of my childhood, I grew up in Switzerland, in Geneva, going to an international school. And now I'm living in London, in the UK. But in between, I was also in Israel, in France. I spent a few years in different places after I finished school as well.
To me, that sounds wonderful because there are so many benefits to growing up internationally. And I mean, if I look at your profile, you're well versed in English, French, and Hebrew. And that's wonderful because not many people speak more than one language.
Yes. So that's true. And I think growing up in an international environment gives you exposure to lots of different perspectives all the time. So constantly stepping into a different culture's shoes, if you like.
Mm-hmm. But I suppose there are also some drawbacks to growing up as a nomad, as you put it. But also there's been, a movement of third culture kids who grow up like you did around the world in different cultures other than the culture that they were born into. What can you tell us about third culture?
Yes, so I grew up very much as part of that third culture in the sense that it's a culture that feels often very lacking roots, right? Rootless.
Wow.
And
yes.
At the same time connects with, in a strong way, with different cultures, right? So one way is to say, this is a group of people that don't have roots. But another way is to say, these are people that have strong roots in many places. And so what I found is that this is a group of people who need to constantly articulate again and again, right? What does it mean to be at home? What is home? And creating a bigger home for oneself than what we would normally think of as our own.
That's very interesting because I've recently learned that lesson.
Mm-hmm.
I always associated home with 4 walls.
Yes.
The place where I went, that was my home. that I spent most of my time in.
Mm-hmm.
And when I lost that home, it was a very uncomfortable transition, but at the same time, a very freeing transition to know that home can be anywhere where you feel happy and put your roots down.
Yes, that's exactly it. Yes.
Yeah.
And it's also the connection to certain people and how you relate to the places where you're at.
Yes. Yes. Now, I want to move on and talk about your experience because, I mean, you've had your own experiences also throughout your life before you actually pivoted and starting to change the dynamics of the power that held you captive. And I've read some of your story, but can you share some of that experience
Mm-hmm.
and how you've pivoted to change that into something positive?
So I think the first thing I'd like to say is I never associated myself as being a person who had a traumatic experience. I thought of myself as a privileged person who didn't have a trauma. And so when I realized that the behaviors that I displayed were behaviors that showed they were sort of like breadcrumbs showing you trauma. I didn't quite understand what it was in relation to, and I had to go hunting for that. And I think in the process of looking for it, it transformed how I related to the symptoms that I displayed. So, for example, I used to freeze a lot. So I would be talking to someone, and suddenly I would freeze or go blank. And I didn't think at the time that that was a sign of trauma. I thought that was just the way I was.
Yes.
Right.
Right.
So going back and working on that, what I found is that the issue never really goes. I still have mini freezes, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I'm able to much more quickly notice, oh, I'm frozen. Oh, it must be because. And so to grow beyond that frozenness or beyond the thing that's triggering
Mm-hmm.
or reactivating the trauma.
Mm-hmm. So, what would you describe as the instigating event that led to all of these breadcrumbs?
It was around conflict. So I was born in Israel, and I came back to Israel from Canada when I was a very young child, in the middle of a war. And so the conflict and the sense of danger was a traumatic thing for me.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I think I was 5 years old when I came back to Israel in the middle of the Yom Kippur War. And so I remember the sirens, and I remember the sense of shock and bereavement on people's faces that I saw around me.
Mm-hmm. And so, how long did you live in Israel at that time, from the age 5 until?
So I was born in Israel till I was 5, and then we went to live in Canada. And we came back to Israel uh, during the Yom Kippur War, right? So I must have been, by then I was about 7, 8.
Okay, and then how long did you stay?
Not long. We were in Israel for 3 months before we went off to Switzerland.
Okay. Okay. And the thing about those experiences are that they do manifest in our bodies. You mentioned that,
Yeah.
you heard the sirens and you can still remember it today. You saw the bereavement on the faces of the
Mm-hmm.
people. You could feel the anxiety in the air, the fear. And your body remembers that. So even though you transitioned to a more stable and neutral country such as Switzerland, Geneva, that traumatic experience of the 3 months stayed with you and manifested itself in different behaviors,
Yes,
which at the time I think you were saying you did not associate with trauma. And I think that's something that, yeah,
that's
I
right.
think that's something that many people struggle with, that the symptoms that they don't have a particular event that they can associate it with. So how did you eventually make that connection?
So I went to study process-oriented psychology, and through that I made the links.
Right.
So process work is the short name of it is process work. Is very interested in our body signals and in our dreams, looking at what they are saying about us, right? And
Yeah.
and so I followed those breadcrumbs, of my symptoms. So, for example, I am very hypermobile, very flexible in my body, and that causes all sorts of problems because I didn't build up my core strength. I didn't know that those things were important, but it also is a symptom of being accommodating, trying uh, to respond to conflict, avoiding conflict by accommodating to it, right? So being bendy.
Yes.
And so the more I associated that hypermobility, not just with a physical symptom, but also with something that is happening in my psychology, the more I was able to address it as an issue of boundaries, of strengthening my core of my being, of who I am, right? Rather
Mm-hmm.
than just following with what other people want, right? Not to rock the boat.
Yeah. So now you work in trauma and collective trauma and violence. And what is interesting for me is you've had this personal experience and you've done the
Mm-hmm.
research. But now what I find interesting is that you see this or you view this as a public health issue. And we need more dialogue around this. Someone actually recently at a conference told me that this is also a social justice issue.
Yes, it is.
Yes,
It's an issue of all of that, right? It's a public health issue because one type of violence creates another type of violence, right? So war between countries also creates civil conflict inside
that's
a
right.
country. It also creates domestic violence in families. So on all the different levels, we find violence, right? Violence in the home, you also find violence on the streets, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
and so to interrupt that violence, we can start the intervention in any one of these points.
Right. And I love your mission to bring, systemic and structural change to the system. So what are some of these
Mhm.
interventions that you've mentioned that we could relate to?
So one of them is using deep democracy. But before I say that, trauma fractures us. It breaks up our society. It also breaks up us as individuals into pieces. And so the work is about putting it all back together.
That's right. Yeah.
So in our communities, putting us back together means bringing a community back together where people have been increasingly isolated, making sure that every voice in that community matters. In the work in individual therapy or coaching work, it's also about bringing all the different parts of ourselves together, not leaving parts of us aside, right? Bringing all of us together so that we can have a cohesive, unified way of approaching our world.
Mm-hmm. And so you're talking about this on a structural scale within countries and within the world. And so at what level do we start to have that conversation, or at what level are you having that conversation?
Yeah. So I'm having that conversation with one to one with individuals. Um, Through the charity Act for Change, we also do it with families, working in family therapy, and with communities. So, faith communities or community centers, bringing together people in a neighborhood. And in that neighborhood, there's lots of different kinds of people, right? There's young people, old people, people at work, people who aren't at work, policemen, teachers, social workers, lots of different people. and we bring them all together to hear each other on a common theme, one common issue, and they bring different perspectives.
So tell me more about the work that you do, the charity Act for Change.
So we work with families and young people who are of the most vulnerable in society, who have experienced violence, a lot of them, maybe domestic violence and abuse, maybe it's been street violence or at school bullying, child sexual exploitation, or there might be in gangs. And we work with them to help them change how they respond to things, but also to change the environment and the support systems around them. Often they don't have a protector in their environment, which is why they've experienced a trauma. And we actively work with them to develop that support system around them.
Okay. That's interesting. I actually had a question earlier this week at one of the talks that I did. And the question that I got was, when we adjudicate, we see people in domestic violence situations. The challenge that they have to get out is because they have such a dependency on their abusers. And so what do you say? How do you help someone like that has this extreme dependency to get out of a situation like that?
So I think that that's one of the most challenging situations that we have. And the first thing is to build up that person's skills and abilities to not be so dependent on that person, to be able to disconnect from them. They first need to have a way of going out in the world. But there are also, through the social services, there are ways of supporting them to move away even before they get those skills, right? To put them in a safe house and to build up their skills from there.
But for someone who stays in that environment, who does not want to move out into a safe house, what are some of the practical things that they can start doing to take back their power, whether it be emotionally or financially, to put them in a situation where they can make the decision to change and move out of that situation?
So I think the first step is to notice the impact that certain behaviors are having on them, and how much of that is their choice, whether they accept it or not. Right? To notice, I've accepted this, I've accepted that. Oh, how they've responded to the actions of the person who's abusing them.
Right. So it is the power of choice. I hear you saying, taking the responsibility and the accountability for their own lives, and really discerning, what role am I playing in this abusive relationship, right? Because there is a part of you that you also bring to that.
To be able to come out of that, you have to first notice it.
Yes. Have that awareness and notice what it is that you bring to the abusive relationship in order to change it.
Yes. And there's a lot that person can do, but first they have to notice it. Oh, this is what I'm doing, and so this is the small little thing that I can start making a change with, right? So take very small steps.
Yeah.
Right?
So what would be an example of something like that for someone who is in that situation at the moment? What is an example of their contribution to a situation, a domestic violence situation, that they can notice?
So I think, so for example, I was speaking this morning with someone who doesn't feel safe at home. The abuser isn't at home with her, but she has a sense that at any time they can come into her home. And so the first thing that she can do, and as a result doesn't sleep. Right? Because she's always afraid.
And always hypervigilant, always aware.
And hypervigilant. Always hypervigilant and restless as a result of not sleeping.
Yes.
And so the first thing is to be able to really secure her house, to put a lock on the door.
Mm-hmm.
Right? There are no locks on her doors. It's easy to come into her house.
Mm-hmm.
So the first is to set those boundaries.
Yes.
And the next is also to find ways to help her sleep.
Yes.
But then that person has to notice, I am doing something that is also feeding this inability to sleep.
Okay. Yes, that's right. So what is it that I am doing that's now affecting the way that I am?
Yes. So what is the first little thing, smallest thing that I can do to interrupt that? Right.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's two steps. One to notice, and then the next from that is, what's the first thing I can do?
Mm-hmm.
Small little things.
Mm-hmm. I've had the experience where the small things is really what gives us the hope for tomorrow that makes the bigger things possible. I think that if you do those small things,
Yes.
in my personal experience, the small thing for me when I had to get out of a relationship that was very toxic and emotionally abusive was I took a different route home from work, because for me it was important that I break the routine that I was in. And whether I stopped at a mall and did window
That's it.
shopping, it was something different that I did, and it made me feel good. It sounds like it's something small, but it was something that I did for myself. And I remember that in that situation, my eating was quite restricted. So I was not really
Yes.
allowed, or no, I wouldn't say I wasn't allowed, but I didn't cook very often. I was told what to eat. And so I would eat something that I wanted and find the power in that to savor what I was eating and then declining the other food that was given to me. It sounds simple, but that was
Yes.
reclaiming my power in the small things to find the courage to later do the big things
So
and
important.
say, now I'm taking the next step and I'm leaving.
Absolutely. I think that's such an important thing. Taking that's an act of agency, right? You took
Yes.
charge. And I think there's one other aspect for me that's very important in doing this work. And that is, as one goes about it, we don't always manage to do that thing, even if it's a small little thing. And so the
Yeah.
easiest thing is to beat ourselves over the head for not having done it, to allow that inner critic to have a big voice. And so for me, the most important piece of doing this work is to counterbalance that critic with a compassionate one that says, I didn't manage it today. Never mind. I'm going to try again. I'll do it again. I'll be back
Yes.
here tomorrow. It's okay.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because if we allow that critic to criticize us and beat us up for not having done the thing that we intended to do to start breaking it, we collude with the abuse. We make that abuse stronger.
Yes. And I always say that compassion is something we give away freely to others, and we do it so easily in our lives. But when it comes to our own, we have such a challenge being compassionate and sharing that compassion with
Yes,
ourselves.
yes. And that's
Yeah.
where, for me, the systemic work joins with the very personal work, because we need to put ourselves at the center of the whole field. We have to remember that we're part of the field.
Yes. And so there is this connection between the systemic and then the personal and self-development work. Because as much as we want to change it on a structural
Yes,
level of the system and how the system works, there's also a part that we have to do for ourselves in order to empower ourselves, where the system and the individual meet.
Well, in a way, we are the system, right? We're like a fractal of the system.
Okay.
So when we change something inside of us, we're also impacting the system.
Yes. Yes, that makes perfect sense to me.
Right?
Because I always say that, for me, if we do that empowerment work, we do that development work that you so beautifully describe, and in the work that you do at X for Change, then we become better human beings. We become more empowered, because the development work is so broad. It touches on so many things, not only compassion, but also the anchor, the foundation in our lives, the connectedness to the self, to who we are, the way that we view the world. And so if we can do that for ourselves, we do create a better and a stronger society. So yes, it makes perfect sense that we are part of that. We are the system.
Yes, we are the system.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Tell me about your book, A Body Call to Presence. What is that book about?
So that book was very much about following those signals in myself, in my body, that brought me to an awareness about something that was going on with me that I didn't know about, right? So, for example, it brought me to
Yes.
an awareness around sexism, about how sexism plays out in my life through how I am in my body.
Tell us a bit more about that.
So it's about how we carry in the body information that comes down to us, not just from our own lives, but also from history, right?
Yes.
So the sexism that we feel or act out isn't just ours. It also comes down to us from generations who've believed certain things and who've behaved in certain ways. And so catching what belongs to us and what we can give back is an important part of that book of how I found that out from my body. Picking that up through the way I held myself, or I hold myself, through my curly hair. I've got very curly hair. Through the petit mal. I had epilepsy as a child. And so what that held in terms of conflict, and starting to give back some of the bits that don't belong to me, right? So the call to presence is about figuring out what do I want to remain present here, and what do I want to give back to history, to ancestors.
And it's important, to discern what belongs to you and what does not. I recently had a conversation with my dad, and it was about his childhood, and it was about how he had developed as into an adulthood, and the things that he'd done, the challenges he's had, and he said to me, Marlene, I broke generational curses, and I changed the way that I live my life compared to my ancestors and even my siblings, because I'm the only surviving one left. And it's because I made different choices to them. And I wasn't held captive to the things that was handed down by ancestors. And it was such an enlightening conversation to have with my dad. And that's what you're talking about. It's about having that awareness and not accepting some of the struggles that have been passed down through the generations. People say, this is just the way that it is. This is just the way that I am. It was that way for my mom. It was that way for my gran. And so this is just the cross I have to bear. But we do have a choice.
Yes. So we get the choice the moment we gain that awareness, right? So until the moment that we recognize that we're carrying something that came down to us from somebody else, we don't have that choice. We just think it's us.
That's right.
But at that moment, we then have a choice.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. So that's what that book is about. Yeah, and then out of that, I wrote my second book, Emerging Figures,
Mm-hmm.
because what I did is
Yes.
I went through that book and I realized there's lots of different figures that I describe in that A Body's Call, and and so I took each one of those figures and I wrote about them, and then after I
Mm-hmm.
wrote about them, I realized these are figures that are trauma figures that constellate through trauma. And then these other figures are figures that support one to come out of trauma. And so that's how I put that together.
Fantastic. And when can we expect Emerging Figures?
Emerging Figures should be coming out in the first quarter of 23.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
I look forward to it because I love how you're saying that some of these emerging figures support you to come out of trauma. And I think that is what we need in this world. You know, the more people I speak to, the more I see the need in people for wanting that guidebook, wanting that path, seeking the knowledge of how do I get through this? How do I overcome
Yes.
and leave my traumatic experiences behind in a way where I can still look at that experience and I can look at the pain and I can recognize it for what it is, but it no longer informs the decisions that I make. Rather, it informs my reason for being in a positive way.
Yes. And often it motivates so much of what's good in the world, right? It motivates a lot of the impulse to make a difference in the world.
Yes, yes, that's so true. People say
Mm.
that there's a recognition more and more that our instigating events that we experience as traumatic, in fact, helps us become better human beings, helps us to make positive changes in the
Yes.
world.
Yes. And I think also um, the use of the word trauma is quite prevalent right now. And we could also look at it as our path to personal development and
That's
growth,
right. Yes.
right?
Yes. And I think, COVID-19 has come around and given the experience to everyone.
Absolutely.
And the ones who I would say did not experience it as traumatic had a built-in resilience because of prior experiences that were traumatic.
That was also my experience, that as soon as the first lockdowns hit, the people who showed the most resilience and were able to take on leadership positions in their communities to help other people cope were those people who previously were having a very hard time.
Yeah. This has been such an interesting conversation. I love it.
I'm very much enjoying having this conversation with you, Marlene.
Lea, tell me, was there anything else that you wanted me to touch on or anything else you wanted to share with the listeners?
I'm also a coach working with global nomads and international people, and that I very much like that work for me. These two parts of my work join very nicely together.
Okay. Do you have any last words of inspiration for the listeners?
Yes, a quote that I've been thinking about this past week from Jung, I'd like to share. It is that we never get over our problems. We just grow bigger than them.
Beautiful. Yes. Carl
Okay.
Jung.
Yeah.
I'm also a fan of
Yes.
his work. It's been so wonderful having you. And I love the work that you do in the community and with individuals. I love that you support the third culture kids that really need that and that movement that they started, and also just bringing the awareness to third culture and then nomads, and also to trauma, collective trauma and violence, and the work that you do starting that dialogue within the community and really bringing about systemic and cultural change. So thank you so much for joining us today and sharing and educating us on all of these topics.
Thank you, Marlene.
Take care. Bye.
Bye-bye.
That wraps up this podcast episode. Thank you for listening. If you enjoy my podcast, please take a minute to give me a rating and review in Apple Podcasts. Please subscribe in your favorite podcast directory so you don't miss an episode. Please consider following My Centered Life on Facebook and Instagram for daily inspiration. Thank you so much for spending this time with me. You can catch me again in the next episode. Same time, same place. Sending you lots of love and light. Bye.